Ever wonder if like those wine experts, the ones with the fancy titles, can really tell a cheap bottle from an expensive one?
Right.
We're going deep into some research about just that.
Cool.
And let me tell you, what we found is pretty surprising.
Yeah.
It turns out how we experience taste is way more complicated and honestly more subjective than you might think.
Yeah, that's right. I think we tend to think of wine tasting as this precise science, like there's a magic formula to it.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating about this research is that it reveals the human element, the psychology that influences even the most trained palates.
So we're going to uncover some surprising findings about expert palates, the
Mhm.
science behind our taste buds.
Mm.
And we'll even touch on a shocking wine scandal that rocked the entire industry.
Oh,
But first, let's start with the basics.
absolutely. Let's break down who these wine experts are and the intense training they go through.
Exactly. The article focuses on sommeliers, specifically those aiming for the coveted Master Sommelier title.
Yes.
Okay, so how difficult is it really?
Think years of dedicated study and passing a series of notoriously tough exams.
Wow.
They cover everything from blind taste tests to in-depth knowledge of global wine production.
Wow, so it's not just about having a refined palate.
Not at all.
Yeah.
These exams even test practical service skills like how to properly present and pour a bottle of wine.
That's intense. It makes you wonder, with all that training, can they actually consistently distinguish between a $10 bottle and a $100 bottle?
Well, that's where the science of taste comes into play and things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this science of taste.
You see, our sense of taste is actually a combination of what our taste buds detect and what we smell. Wine has hundreds of these aroma compounds, and they play a huge role in how we perceive the flavor.
So even if we're tasting the same wine, our individual experience can be influenced by other things, like our expectations or even the environment we're in.
Exactly. And there's research to back this up. There was a study where they served white wine dyed red to experienced tasters.
Wait, so they thought they were drinking red wine?
Yes. And the results were fascinating. Even with the altered color, these tasters still described the wine using typical red wine terms like jammy or spicy.
Wow, that's a great example.
Yeah.
It really shows you how powerful those psychological factors can be, even for people with highly trained palates.
And if we consider these findings in the context of wine pricing, it starts to challenge the assumption that a higher price automatically means better quality.
So are you saying we could be fooled into thinking a cheap wine is actually a fancy one?
It's definitely possible. And on the flip side, we might dismiss a perfectly good, more affordable wine simply because it doesn't have a hefty price tag.
This is already making me rethink how I choose wine.
Really?
And speaking of affordability, the article also talks about how modern wineries are using science to make great tasting wine at all price points.
Right. They can actually manipulate those aroma compounds and tweak the flavors with incredible precision.
So even if you're on a budget, you can still find a bottle of wine that you'll enjoy.
Absolutely. Studies have even shown that people who aren't wine experts often prefer less expensive wines in blind taste tests. Have you ever been pleasantly surprised by a budget-friendly bottle?
All the time.
Yeah,
But I'd imagine those experts with their rigorous training could still spot the difference, right?
you'd think so, wouldn't you? But surprisingly, even experts can get it wrong. And there are a few reasons why. One factor is something called confirmation bias.
Okay, explain that one to me. What is confirmation bias?
It's the tendency to look for information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if it means overlooking evidence that contradicts them. So if a sommelier already knows a wine is expensive, they might subconsciously search for those qualities they associate with expensive wines, even if they're not actually as prominent as they think.
Ah, so it's like when you buy a new gadget and suddenly it seems amazing, even if it's not really that different from your old one. You're just looking for reasons to justify the price you paid.
Exactly. And then there's the sheer volume of wine that professionals might taste in a day or during a competition. Imagine trying to accurately assess and remember the nuances of hundreds of different wines in a row. Your senses become overloaded, your memory becomes unreliable, and even the most discerning palate can be tricked.
That makes sense. The article mentions a study where judges were given the same wine 3 times, and only 10% of them rated it consistently each time.
Wow.
That's wild.
It really highlights just how subjective taste can be, even at the highest level.
Yeah.
And then we can't forget the impact of serving temperature.
Oh, right. A too warm red or a too cold white can totally change the flavor profile.
Exactly. And that can throw off even the most experienced tasters. Speaking of things that can alter the taste of wine, there was a pretty shocking scandal that shook the entire wine industry.
Let's talk about that. I'm ready for the juicy details.
Well, it happened back in the 1980s. Some Austrian winemakers were caught adding a chemical called diethylene glycol to their wines. And get this, diethylene glycol is found in antifreeze.
Antifreeze, that's insane. Why would anyone do that?
Apparently, it was used to enhance the sweetness and give cheaper wines a smoother, richer taste, making them seem more expensive and desirable.
So they were basically trying to trick people into thinking they were drinking a higher quality wine.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
But the consequences were severe.
I bet. What happened?
Well, as soon as the scandal broke, sales of Austrian wine plummeted, their reputation was tarnished, and the entire industry suffered a huge blow.
That makes sense. Who would want to risk buying a bottle of wine that could potentially contain antifreeze?
Exactly. But there was a silver lining to this whole mess.
Really? What was that?
The scandal forced Austria to completely overhaul its wine regulations, which are now among the strictest in the world.
So they turned a disaster into an opportunity to improve their standards and rebuild trust with consumers.
Precisely. It's a fascinating example of how a crisis can ultimately lead to positive change. But even with stricter regulations, the scandal reminds us that the pursuit of profit can sometimes overshadow ethical considerations, even in the world of fine wine.
That's a great point. Makes you think about the importance of transparency and accountability in the wine industry.
Absolutely. But before we get too serious, let's shift gears and talk about what all of this means for us, the everyday wine drinkers.
That's a great idea. After all, most of us aren't master sommeliers. So what are the key takeaways for those of us enjoying wine at home?
Well, first, it's a good reminder that even experts aren't perfect. They're just as susceptible to biases and perceptual tricks as the rest of us.
So we shouldn't feel intimidated by fancy titles or expert opinions.
Not at all. Price is not always an indicator of quality, and thanks to advancements in winemaking, you can find delicious wines at all price points.
That's reassuring to hear.
And most importantly, remember that taste is subjective. What you enjoy is what matters most, regardless of what anyone else says.
This is all incredibly insightful. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment to check in with you, our listener.
Yes, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Have you ever had an experience where you were pleasantly surprised by an inexpensive wine?
Or have you ever been fooled by a fancy label or a high price tag?
We'd love to hear your stories and perspectives, so feel free to share your thoughts with us on social media or through our website.
And in the meantime, we'll continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of wine.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore those personal preferences a bit further and look at how you can approach wine with more curiosity and mindfulness. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of wine.
Yeah.
We've just uncovered some surprising truths about expert palates and the science behind how we perceive taste.
It's fascinating how much more goes into wine tasting than we often realize.
Exactly. So much of it comes down to personal preference, even for those master sommeliers we were talking about.
Speaking of those master sommeliers, I think it's worth exploring what makes their expertise so unique.
Okay, let's delve into that. The article mentioned that it's not just about those blind taste tests, right?
Right. It goes way beyond that. They need a deep understanding of the history of wine, the different production methods, and the nuances of wine regions around the world.
So it's like they have an entire encyclopedia of wine knowledge stored in their brains.
Quite literally. They need to know about different grape varieties and their characteristics, as well as how specific climates and soil types influence the flavors of wines from various regions.
Wow, that's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
So they're not just wine tasters, they're like wine detectives uncovering the complete story behind every bottle.
That's a great way to put it. And on top of that, they need to be excellent communicators.
Oh, right. Because what good is all that knowledge if they can't share it with others?
Exactly. They might be recommending pairings to restaurant patrons or educating consumers about different wines. Communication is key.
So they need a refined palate and the ability to explain those complex flavors to people who might not be as experienced.
Precisely. And let's not forget about those practical service skills that are tested during the Master Sommelier exam. Things like properly opening and serving a bottle, knowing when to decant it, and even handling tricky customers who might question their recommendations. It's a multifaceted profession that requires a unique blend of sensory skills knowledge and those all-important people skills.
No wonder achieving that Master Sommelier title is such a prestigious accomplishment.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about their passion for wine and their commitment to honing their craft over many years.
But even with all that training and expertise, as we've discussed, they're still human.
Right. They're subject to the same psychological influences as anyone else. Taste is ultimately subjective.
So what does this all mean for us, the everyday wine drinkers?
Well, I think it's incredibly liberating, don't you? We shouldn't feel pressure to have expert-level knowledge or follow strict rules when it comes to enjoying wine.
I agree. It's more about the experience and finding what you enjoy. But maybe we can take a page from the Master Sommelier's playbook and approach wine with a bit more mindfulness and curiosity.
I love that idea. Next time you open a bottle, really pay attention to the aromas, the flavors, the texture, even the feelings it evokes.
It's about savoring those subtle details, just like the experts do.
Exactly. You might surprise yourself with what you discover about your own preferences. And don't be afraid to ask questions whether you're at a wine shop, a restaurant, or even just chatting with friends who share your love of wine. We can all learn from each other's experiences.
It's all about that shared journey of discovery. Speaking of discoveries, the article touched on something that I found particularly fascinating, the way that technology is impacting the world of wine.
Oh, yes. The advancements in winemaking techniques are definitely blurring the lines between those cheap and expensive categories.
Right. They're able to manipulate the flavors with incredible precision, which makes me wonder if this technology keeps evolving. Could there come a point where we can't even tell the difference?
That's a fascinating question. If wineries can consistently produce high-quality wines at lower costs, it could revolutionize the way we think about wine.
Imagine a world where everyone can enjoy a fantastic bottle of wine without breaking the bank. It could really democratize access to quality wines.
Absolutely. Though it does raise some interesting questions about the future of the industry.
Like what?
Well, if technology can essentially replicate the flavors and qualities of those high-end wines, will people still place the same value on traditional notions of prestige and terroir?
That's a great point. Will those expensive bottles still hold the same allure? Or will we see a shift towards a more technologically driven approach to winemaking?
Only time will tell how it all unfolds, but it's an exciting time to be a wine enthusiast, that's for sure.
I completely agree. But for now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have some ground to cover in our deep dive, including a fascinating anecdote from the world of wine judging.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, the article recounts a rather amusing incident that happened at a prestigious wine competition. Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were about to discuss a fascinating anecdote about a wine competition. Are you ready to hear about this?
Absolutely, all ears.
Okay, so picture this. You're at a prestigious wine competition, surrounded by world-renowned experts, swirling, sniffing, and sipping their way through a vast selection of wines.
I can practically smell the oaken tannins from here. What happened?
Well, it turns out that even in this high-stakes environment with all these trained palates, things can go hilariously wrong.
Yeah.
The article describes an incident where one of the judges accidentally knocked over their glass of wine.
Oh no! A spilled Cabernet Sauvignon. That's a sommelier's nightmare.
Exactly. But here's the funny part. Instead of stopping the proceedings or calling for a cleanup crew, the judge, in a moment of sheer panic, quickly refilled their glass from a nearby water pitcher.
Wait, they filled their wine glass with water,
Yeah,
and nobody noticed.
Not right away. The judge continued swirling, sniffing, and even tasting the wine as if nothing had happened.
Oh my goodness, I can only imagine the look on their face when they realized what they were actually drinking.
The article doesn't go into detail about that, but I can only imagine the embarrassment. What's even more surprising is that the judge actually gave the water a rather detailed tasting note.
No way, what did they say?
Apparently, they described it as having delicate floral aromas, a crisp acidity, and a surprisingly complex minerality.
Wow, so even water can sound like a fine wine when described in that kind of language.
It really goes to show how much our perception of taste is influenced by context and expectation.
Yeah.
If you're in that environment surrounded by experts swirling and sniffing, it's easy to get caught up in the moment and convince yourself you're tasting something extraordinary.
It's a good reminder to take those tasting notes with a grain of salt, even from the most seasoned professionals.
Exactly. It also highlights the importance of being mindful and present when we're tasting wine. Don't just go through the motions or rely on someone else's opinion. Pay attention to your own senses and what you're actually experiencing.
It's about enjoying the journey, the discovery of new flavors, and the personal connection you make with the wine.
Well said. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating, complex, and sometimes even hilarious world of wine.
It's been a pleasure exploring these surprising findings and thought-provoking questions with you.
Likewise, I hope our listeners have enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
And remember, the next time you open a bottle of wine, whether it's a budget-friendly find or a special occasion splurge, take a moment to appreciate the experience. Savor the aromas, the flavors, the textures, and don't be afraid to trust your own palate.
Cheers to that. and to the ongoing adventure of discovering the wines that bring us joy. Until next time, happy sipping.